Greetings. In this video lecture, we are going to continue our exploration of the Mahayana branch of Buddhism and focus in on Japanese Buddhism and two very prominent forms of Mahayana Buddhism in Japan, namely Pure Land Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. Just to rewind a little bit, you'll recall that early on in the Buddhist tradition, there emerged different interpretations of the nature of the Buddha, different interpretations of the Buddha's teachings, and eventually even different bodies of scripture that were attributed to the Buddha or other authoritative figures within the Buddhist tradition. And this led to a basic distinction in the Buddhist tradition between Theravadan Buddhism, which is represented here on the left-hand side, namely the Way of the Elders, which becomes the dominant form or a dominant form of Buddhism in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. And then, broadly speaking, we have the umbrella term Mahayana Buddhism, generally translated as the great vehicle within Buddhism, which has a tremendous diversity within it in terms of the schools that are inspired by the kind of foundational principles of Mahayana. And we discussed some of these fundamental differences in the previous video lecture, but just as a bit of a reminder, in Theravadan Buddhism, we really have a very clear focus on Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha. And in Mahayana schools, we start to see an emphasis on many different Buddhas, right? Acknowledging the existence of other Buddhas. And eventually, we have groups and schools that start to develop around the personality and legend and myth of other Buddhas besides the historical Buddha. Also, in the Mahayana tradition, we have this emphasis on this great, really important concept, namely the Bodhisattva and the Bodhisattva vow. Bodhisattvas are mythic figures who have salvific powers. They have powers that come from a fundamental vow that often has essentially to do with their compassion for all sentient beings. Perhaps the greatest vow of all is that undertaken by Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, who vows not to attain nirvana or escape the cycle of suffering and rebirth, samsara, until he can bring all other enlightened beings with him. It's not to say that there isn't a fundamental value placed on compassion within Theravada schools, but it just really becomes very much a focal point. Um, Also, in the Mahayana tradition, we have an evolution of the no self doctrine. The no self doctrine, as propounded in the Theravadan tradition, suggests that, of course, that there is no self on Atman, in contrast with Upanishadic views of the Atman as a absolutely indestructible, stable, eternal essence that resides within all of us. Um, the no self doctrine in early Buddhism argues that we are a combination of different parts that are in constant interaction with each other and in constant states of flux and transformation and change. And there is no essential entity or essence that stands behind that collection of parts. In Mahayana Buddhism, we have an evolution of that idea in the doctrine of emptiness or shunyata. The idea behind emptiness is that all things, not just ourselves, right, but all things are devoid of some sort of absolutely true atomic essence. And the implication of that idea is that, well, there are many implications depending on the school and the interpretation, right? But one possibility is that what we are is thoroughly constituted, and all things really we are constituted by their relationships and their causal relationships with other things. There is no essential I or self, but we are constituted by our constantly interchanging and interwoven relationships with others. Things are defined in some sense by what they are related to or what they are not. There's no essential kind of essential form of the cup, right? It is only what it is. in the practice of use and in relation to other concepts by way of contrast and relationship. Another possible interpretation of this idea of emptiness, right, is to break down boundaries between things and binaries in particular. One very interesting ramification of that is the idea that there is really no distinction between us and the Buddha, for example. Obviously, thinking about the historical Buddha as a revered figure or other Buddhas, right, as objects of reverence that are totally apart from us and separate from us and bigger than us, and all those kinds of things are pretty common in on the ground Buddhism's of all forms. But the emptiness doctrine might suggest that indeed, because there is no essence of Buddha and there's no essence of self, that the boundary between them breaks down and it becomes the next conclusion is that actually Buddha is all pervasive, that Buddha mind is all pervasive, that we Buddhahood is part of everything in a sense, or resides within us, and we need only to kind of peel back the layers and discover the Buddha within, rather than seeking the Buddha in some external scripture or shrine or in history or in some other cosmic realm or something along those lines. This would also suggest that there's a breakdown between the binary of samsara, the realm that we are in, and nirvana, the realm that we are meant to pursue or want to attain, and that there's some sort of boundary there, right? Even the metaphor of the bodhisattva seems to suggest that sometimes, where the bodhisattva of compassion is kind of on the edge, right, hanging right at the threshold of attaining enlightenment, and then turns back around and comes back to us, suggesting that there is a very clear boundary between our realm and the realm of nirvana. But emptiness, when applied to this idea, would suggest to us that these names, these distinctions, are really just kind of conventional ways of thinking about things. And that in essence, there really is no distinction between samsara and nirvana. In other words, if you know how to look at things, nirvana or enlightenment resides right here, right now, not on some long, very long pathway through many, many lifetimes, right? And somewhere down the road, then we go into that space called nirvana. Instead, some schools of Buddhism, Zen is one of them, suggest that this is not the right way to think about enlightenment, that enlightenment, in fact, resides here and now. And according to different interpretations, maybe it can happen to us spontaneously and suddenly, or maybe it is the product of some sort of gradual process of meditative practice, right? That we get the flashes of insight, flashes of enlightenment in this lifetime here and now. There's, in general, a more of an immediacy about Mahayana Buddhism, and the emptiness doctrine is put in service of that in suggesting that nirvana is an enlightenment. The goal is not some faraway thing, but is much closer to us than had been previously realized. The emptiness doctrine also suggests to us that the names that we use for things, the labels that we use for things, they are conventional and they're merely practical, and they don't really, in essence, name anything essential, right? So that does pick up on some old school Buddhist ideas, right? You might recall the Buddha's teaching that once we cross the river with the raft, then we leave the raft behind. That we shouldn't be clinging, right, to things, doctrines, teachings, etc. Emptiness doctrine helps in many ways to uproot that. One last thing about emptiness and this breakdown of binaries. Emptiness can be seen as being very much in the service of compassion, because if we're going to break down these binaries and these boundaries between things, right, and really emphasize the idea of not essence, right, what we essentially are, but what we are as a product of interconnectedness and relatedness. Um, that's a very good conditioning idea for feeling compassion for the other. Not only that we're in the same boat, right? We're all in the realm of suffering, but we are all kind of interconnected with each other and constituted by our relationships. There is, under the framework of emptiness, there is no way for ultimately for us to, one of us to put ourselves above others, right? We are all part of this essentially interconnected web. So these are just getting some of these fundamental principles out there from the get-go. And let's turn to some of the ways in which these ideas got translated into very concrete and very influential forms of belief and practice within Japanese Buddhism. Remember this depiction, the Baba Chakra, and in particular, we want to focus on the Buddha up there in the corner, who is apart from the cycle, right? At least in this depiction, has departed the cycle of samsara, and there we all are going around in the circle and occupying our pizza slices, right, in the different realms of existence. And in this depiction, anyway, the Buddha has departed this whole the, departed the whole cycle, right? And that's what his enlightenment was all about. And so we should try to follow the same path and jettison ourselves from this cycle of birth and rebirth, very much apart from the world. Now, the other version of the Baba Chakra that we studied it carefully earlier in the course placed Buddhas within these realms. So that's more of a kind of Mahayana sensibility that you see developing in that version. So Shakyamuni takes center stage, right? According to Theravada Buddhism, right? Is very much the focal point and the inspiration. And when he has accomplished his goals, and when ultimately he dies, he achieves parinirvana and departs from the cycle. But Mahayana Buddhism picks up on the idea that there must be many beings who have attained enlightenment, right? If the cosmos has an infinite extent, then surely there must have been other beings in other times and places and other universes and other cosmic realms and in our cosmic realm, an infinitely kind of cycling form of existence. There must have been other Buddhas and indeed many other Buddhas. And here's an image that captures that idea, the idea of a Buddha field, that there are, yes, we can place one Buddha at the center if we want to, like Shakyamuni, but really that center place is interchangeable. That location for a Buddha and that Buddha's story can easily be replaced with another Buddha and another wonderful story and another form of inspiration. These Buddhas are of many, many different types in Mahayana Buddhism, but some of them extend themselves back into our world and have influence here, according to this mythic structure. And some of them, their stories are so powerful that they start to take on a life of their own and become a kind of focal point of different religious movements within Mahayana Buddhism in East Asia. And Pure Land Buddhism is a classic example of that. The idea behind Pure Land Buddhism, which got going um, really in China when Buddhism emerged in China, there are Sanskrit texts that describe the celestial Buddha Amitabha, but it really gets going in East Asia. Amitabha Buddha, that's the Sanskrit name, right, for this celestial Buddha, resides in a pure land, a land, the Western Paradise. So another kind of cosmic bubble or realm out there somewhere. And it's kind of like in the multiverse, right? He has his own kind of dimension in a sense out there. And he's not content simply to reside there, right? As many Buddhas, in fact, do. Instead, he extends his power and his compassion into our world and makes the promise, in some sense, that if we display devotion and trust in his teaching, then we will be delivered over into this pure land, this Western paradise, after we die. Um, So the main form of practice within Pure Land Buddhism is chanting the name of Amitabha, or chanting the name of Amituofo in Chinese, or Amida in Japanese, calling out to the Buddha of the Pure Land. The Buddha of the Pure Land will hear us, right? If we call out with utter trust and devotion, and will reach out, right, and share his grace with us, and then ultimately draw us into the Pure Land after we die. So, this chanting, but also the feeling behind the chanting, that is utterly recognizing that we are dependent, right, on the grace of Amitabha Buddha, right, in order to be delivered. So in Japan, right, there's a distinction that's made between this tradition and, say, the Zen tradition, which really, suggests that this tradition, the Pure Land tradition, emphasizes the power of the other, right? So everything is reliant upon the power of Amitabha Buddha or Amida Butsu, right, to deliver us over into the Pure Land. And it's in Amida Buddha's hands, right, basically. Now, all of this starts to sound a little, Christian-esque, I suppose, right? When we think about the way in which, we are particularly forms of Protestantism where we're utterly dependent on God's power and grace to deliver us and to offer us salvation. Here's how this fits into the Buddha scheme. This is really a good example of manifesting the Buddha manifesting compassion, which we then reflect to others. And of course, what other there might it's a great strategy for, in some sense, realizing on the ground what no self means, right? To utterly devoid ourselves and kind of leave ego aside, right? And say, I can't do anything to achieve this salvation, and I must push my ego aside and allow the other power to deliver me. So you can you can definitely fit, right, these teachings within Pure Land Buddhism, within broader Buddhist principles. Um, there's a lovely example, literary example of the kind of journey of Pure Land Buddhism for devotees in the Kama no Chome story of the monk, right, Ojoki, who goes off to retire to his little hut off in the mountains. And he recounts his story as a Pure Land Buddhist and reaches some really interesting philosophical conclusions about his life spent as a Pure Land Buddhist in that particular text. Here's a depiction of the Pure Land. And as you can see, it looks pretty nice. And it is associated with a kind of comfort and ease, and indeed a kind of sensual pleasure, right? A lack of tension or strain. It kind of looks like a beautiful spa in the mountains. And it should be noted that this is not the same as nirvana within Pure Land Buddhism. This is not meant to be the be all end all in a sense. Um, it is a place that where it's a lot easier to engage in higher forms of practice like meditation and things like that, and definitely could condition one's eventual arrival at enlightenment. But in Pure Land Buddhism, it's interesting that this goal that's so important, right, within so many forms of Buddhism are so important in the kind of foundational narrative of what Buddhism and Buddhist teaching are all about. The idea of nirvana enlightenment kind of fades into the background, and the attaining the Pure Land really becomes the major focus. All right, let's flip to the other side of the coin. If Pure Land Buddhism takes Buddhist teaching and interprets it to emphasize reliance on the other power, right? The power emanating from the Pure Land Buddha, or maybe from Bodhisattva or something like that, and reliance upon that, then Zen is about self power. Zen is very much about our own situation, our own effort, our own attainment, our own experience. It is very much about rejection of those kinds of external forms of rescue, right, or salvation, or something along those lines, right? Um, and this is a famous characterization of what Zen is about, according to the figure who, according to legend, brought Zen to China, namely Bodhidharma, uh, carrying along, according to the tradition, a secret teaching. So the Buddha is saying things kind of in public, right, and being recorded in these lectures, et cetera, that constitute certain bodies of scripture, right? But then, according to the kind of Zen mythos, he also transmitted a kind of secret, what religion scholars call esoteric knowledge, right? That is a kind of hidden knowledge that's passed along not through outward public institutional forms, right? But kind of passed along from teacher to student, right? Down a line of transmission, a kind of in the background, sotto voce religious teaching that's accompanying the outward stuff, right? So Bodhidharma is the one who first transmitted that idea and brought it to China, according to the legend. And Bodhidharma is this set of verses is attributed to Bodhidharma in trying to characterize what Zen is about. A special transmission beyond tradition, right? So special transmission is that hidden teaching, right? Beyond tradition. So the all of the kind of accumulated scriptures, right, and all the accumulated teachings and all of this kind of stuff and interpretations, um, all of this stuff is transcended, right, by Zen teaching with no dependence on words and letters. So again, there you're not going to find the truth in reading scriptures or philosophy or something like that, or debating kind of abstruse issues in Buddhist philosophy and theology and things like that. It's not about the words, it transcends language, and it goes beyond language and all of the kind of traditional sources of authority and guidance and many forms of Buddhism, pointing directly to the human mind, seeing into one's nature and becoming Buddha, right? So that very inward turn, right? Turning directly to the human mind, the mind that resides within us, right? And engaging in direct experience, immersion within it, and seeing there reflected in our nature, in our mind, right? The nature of the Buddha, of Buddhahood. So there you see that breakdown, right? Not Buddha out there somewhere, right, in a statue or some preaching some sermon or something like that. The Buddha resides here within us, reflected in our own mind. If we are able to train the mind, clean the mind, right, such that that Buddhahood is reflected there. Here you say the great empty circle, right, which is kind of the quintessential symbol of Zen. It's The calligraphy is one of the practices associated with Zen. So it's painted with one brush stroke spontaneously, and is a empty circle. So there's emptiness for you, and a reflection of the simplicity of Zen teaching, right? The idea is not to add more stuff, like memorize more lists and use that as part of a meditation practice, or meditate on those incredibly complicated paintings with all those Buddhas all over the place, and to clutter one's mind with all of that stimulus, right? And all of those concepts. Um, the idea is actually to get rid of all of that, right? To go in the opposite direction, to clear away as much as possible, to unclutter the mind, right? And get it back to its absolute blankness, emptiness, and simplicity. And that is where we find Buddhahood within ourselves, according to Zen teachings. Um, there's another very famous sermon that comes to us out of the Zen tradition, the flower sermon, where the basically the content of it is, he is preaching to the Sangha, teaching to all the monks, and they're kind of peppering the Buddha with questions, and their curiosity and passion and enthusiasm is driving them. But then the Buddha holds up a flower, right, in silence. And one of the listeners, one of the monks, Kashyapa, smiles and understands, and in that moment has achieved a piece of enlightenment. And that too is very much a Zen story. It's not about the words, it's about some sort of mysterious, mystical transmission, right? That occurs, right, in the midst of Zen practice. Again, the idea is to declutter things and simplify things in Zen. Um, just to tell the story a bit, the tradition, from a historical standpoint, the tradition originates in China and becomes a kind of amalgam, actually, of Buddhist teachings and of indigenous Chinese teachings, particularly in Taoism. And in philosophical forms of Taoism, you'll see similar kinds of ideas expressed, right? About simplicity and peeling away the layers and following a natural way, etc., right? And not cluttering ourselves with learning and culture and all that kind of stuff, but rather try to return to a much more pristine state, right? In China, Zen is called Chan, and Chan is sometimes thought to be yet another kind of it's a translation or a hearing of a Sanskrit word, dhyana, which means meditation loosely. And then in Japan, Chan becomes Zen. And then in Korea, when this movement gets to Korea, it becomes Sun. So all kind of related words in this game of etymological telephone. Um, As we suggested before, as the Bodhidharma passage indicates, the Zen is about the rejection of traditional authority. It definitely has its own kind of hierarchy or recognition of traditional authoritative figures who have passed along Zen teachings, right, over the centuries, but generally steps away from grand institutional forms of Buddhism like Pure Land. Um, Zen is very much about the integration of Buddhist teaching in everyday life. And so we'll see lots of examples of Zen being practiced while people are doing everyday things, like like gardening or like drinking tea, or you can make a kind of Zen of everything. And if you go to the Barnes and Noble, you'll see lots of kind of crummy commodified versions of this. But in theory, anything that we do, if we try to maintain attention and mindfulness and awareness in engaging in that activity, and simple embodied activities are very good for this, right? We can engage in kind of a Zen practice within those activities, within the everydayness, right, of our lives. So being present to whatever it is we're doing, whether it's washing dishes or doing yard work or walking for that matter. Walking meditation is, of course, a big one within Buddhist uh, spheres, right, in general. But walking is certainly a good way to manifest Zen practice and values. Again, the emptiness doctrine is very important here. Zen emphasizes the emptiness of the Buddha, right? There's a famous kind of statement, right, with it from Zen Buddhism: if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him, which sounds kind of non-Buddhist, right? But the idea there is the Buddha as an external figure, as some sort of authoritative teacher from way back when, someone to be revered in temples or whatever, is really only going to get in the way, right, of attaining the real experience that the Buddha was talking about, right? So that, again, that idea of a kind of external figure to be listened to, worshipped, revered, etc., is something that the Zen tradition breaks down. It's not that they don't have statues of the Buddha, but it's a way of looking at things, right? So the emptiness of the Buddha's teaching, again, it's not about the complexity and interpretation and philosophy and working out problems analytically and all that kind of thing, which is a very prominent phenomenon within the Buddhist world in general. Zen says, no, that's not the way to do it. It's in fact not about complexity and analysis. It's about simplicity of experience. Um, the emptiness of enlightenment, right, as I mentioned before, is about breaking down the boundary between where we are now and some place that is nirvana. Nirvana or enlightenment can be found right here in this world, in everyday experience, if we just know how to look at it. Um, and here's a lovely statement from one of the Zen patriarchs in Chan Buddhism. The body is the Bodhi tree. Remember what the Bodhi tree is? The Bodhi tree is the place in India, an actual place, right? A tree where the Buddha attained enlightenment, the historical Buddha. But according to Zen, the point is not to go and make a pilgrimage to the Bodhi tree. It's right here, right? The Buddha could have been enlightened anywhere. You can carry the Bodhi tree around with you. It's your body. The mind is like a clear mirror, and at all times we must strive to polish it so it reflects properly. And it must not let the dust collect. Originally, there is no Bodhi tree. The mirror has no stand. The Buddha nature is simply, basically clean and pure. Where is the room for dust? If you know how to understand it, if you engage in Zen practice, you're able to clear away the dust, right? And um, recognize, right, that actually, according to the emptiness doctrine, it's not the idea is not like engaging in this intense effort to continually obsessively polish, but to recognize, right, that it was empty in the first place and pristine in the first place and needed no cleaning. So, what are some of the practices that Zen folks engage in to try to attain this state of purity, this original state, the cleaning, but then the attainment of the state of purity that needs no cleaning? Um, I've mentioned integrating Zen presence and Zen focus and mindfulness in everyday practices, but also in the context of kind of Zen communities, right? There are a number of practices that are utilized to try to attain this level of awareness or these flashes of enlightenment. One of them is, of course, Zazen, which is sitting meditation, and it is a form of meditation that really emphasizes, again, the simplicity of the breath and attempting to clear the mind, right? As opposed to other forms of Buddhist meditation where it might be about visualizing things, right? Or it might be about um, meditating on particular things or running through kinds of lists of Buddhist teachings or something along those lines, where there's actually quite a bit of content, right, that's being processed within some forms of Buddhist meditation. Um, in Zen meditation and Zazen, simplicity is the key. There may be some things that are implanted, right, through the process of transmission between teacher and student, but certainly the idea is not to multiply content of meditation. It is to try to peel things away and get back to the simplicity of the simplest, most transparent, most reflective, most pristine experience of mind as possible. One of the things that Zen teachers do is engage in this practice of mondo, or a kind of dialogue, right, between teacher and student. And the dialogue is often founded on these kind of mind-stopping statements called koans. Um, and they're designed to be confusing on purpose, to pose a question that seemingly has no logical answer. And that is precisely the point. The idea here is to stop the analytical mind in its tracks, right? To frustrate it or to have it play itself out such that the realization is this scheming mind, right, trying to process a problem and solve a problem, or analyze it or something like that, is really kind of the thing that gets us into trouble because it steers us away from the kind of pristine, immediate experience of mind that has been emptied out. So here are some examples of this. What is the path of no birth? That's the big question in Buddhism, right? What is the way to escape the cycle of samsara? And the traditional answer is last night I lost 3 coins in my bed. So your mind might kick in and say there, okay, so the 3 coins must represent 3 stages of something, and I've lost them, so now I need to recapture them. So what are the 3 stages that I need to go to in order to attain the path of no birth? That's utterly the wrong way to go about it, right? And I'm sure that the Zen master would correct any of that kind of thinking. How can I cultivate the Buddha mind? I call this a staff. What would you call it? Okay. Another kind of mind stopper, right? Um, does a dog have Buddha nature? Moo, no, or emptiness, whatever that means, right? It's a mind stopping moment. And by the way, in the lovely old series, The Long Search, The Land of the Disappearing Buddha, you'll see plenty of examples of uh, this kind of activity in practice, right? The idea that between the master and the student, there's this kind of exchange, which is maybe seems at the surface nonsensical, but what's important is the experience that's behind it, what's going on in meditation, and the master is able to discern whether the student is going in the right direction or not. Um, Other statements are designed just simply to be what they are and to focus the mind or stop the mind in its tracks. And in that kind of silence, that kind of stunned silence, that's actually where the flash of insight really resides. Um, Immersing ourselves in experience. So the ripe fruit falls from the tree. It's just that moment where the ripe fruit or tomato or whatever, right, is pulling on the branch and then plop, right down it goes. And it's just in that kind of moment, right? It's just a momentary phenomenon, a fleeting phenomenon, but somehow residing there, and this is symbolized, if I'm going to analyze it, right, by the ripeness of the fruit, right, which has now fallen, and it's fallen such that the seeds can produce regeneration. But I'm doing a totally non-Zen thing there by analyzing it poetically. A baby's hand releases one object to grasp for another. It's a wonderful kind of image, right, of simplicity, but so much resides right there, right, in say the observation of children. You can see how there's peace that kind of resides there within that experience. Um, the bamboo leaf slowly bends under the weight of the snow, and the snow falls. There's a wonderful early modern Japanese poet named Basho, who wrote haiku, and is such a master of these kinds of moments, these kinds of experiences, where if you just are there in the moment, the flash of enlightenment is there, right there with us. A poem about staying in a hut, and an old helmet is sitting on the floor, on the dusty floor, and there's a cricket in the helmet, and the cricket chirps, and it echoes within the helmet, and it echoes within the hut. And just in that sound resides some kind of very deep truth. Or sitting by a pond and a big bullfrog jumps in and makes that kind of kerplunk sound that resonates right across the pond, and you immerse yourself in that momentary, transient kind of experience, right? Um, it is thought that this, according to certain forms of Zen practice, is exactly where enlightenment resides, right at here, right now. And they also, this idea also embeds that idea of impermanence and suffering because these moments are just so fleeting and transient, right? There's like almost a kind of tragic romantic quality to it, that you have the experience, you're there, and then it's gone. And then you can talk about it afterwards, but it's not the same, right? It's just not the same. As we noted before, the truth is not transmitted in terms of words and letters. The 10 Oxherding tales, which are part of the kind of Chan Zen canon, give us a interesting depiction of this pursuit of enlightenment, this pursuit of the truth or the deeper experience, and they can be interpreted in many different ways, of course, right? But there is an interesting part in the uh, 10 Oxherding tales, so spoiler alert, which brings the seeker back to the world, right? As the seeker goes off and chases after the ox, right, as if pursuing enlightenment, achieves something, but then doesn't hang out in some celestial cosmic realm, but comes back to this very world. Um, One last statement from the Zen tradition. The mountain is climbed and the vista appears. A great emblem of a surprising moment where you come around the corner on a trail or you're up there in the mountains and you come through some sort of valley or something like that, then all of a sudden there's this wonderful view that awaits you, right? And in that moment of surprise, right, and enjoyment, you find what the whole thing was all about. And this is the last video lecture in this particular course. And I think that the mountain vista is a nice way to end it. And your journey within the Buddhist tradition. And we even have a little hut there, right, to match up with another one of the readings.